So for weeks now, it feels like the Middle East has just been teetering on this knife edge.
Absolutely.
The recent Israel-Iran conflict, the way it escalated so fast. And then even after they announced a ceasefire, we were seeing reports, missiles, civilian casualties. It's just incredibly volatile.
It really is. And it's striking, isn't it, how something that seems, well, contained geographically can just send these huge ripples outwards.
Exactly.
We're talking like direct hits on China's big Belt and Road project, and suddenly alarm bells ringing really loudly over in Pakistan.
That's what we want to unpack today. Really dig into the strategic side of things, energy, logistics, the geopolitics of it all. We want to show you how this kind of regional mess can actually seriously threaten massive global projects and maybe even shift the whole geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, it's a domino effect.
So by the end of this, you'll hopefully have a clearer picture of this really complex Web China's investments, why Pakistan is so worried about its borders, and what it all means for those bigger trade corridors, Indo-Pacific, Eurasia, all of it.
It's definitely like a global chess game. Moves over here cause big reactions way over there.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the stakes, maybe we should rewind a bit. Back to June 13th, 2025. That seems to be when things really caught fire with Israel's surprise air attack. What exactly happened there?
That's right, June 13th. Israel launched this offensive targeting Iranian military sites, but also, critically, nuclear facilities. Their justification was that Iran was getting dangerously close to having nuclear weapons capability.
And Iran didn't just sit back.
No, not at all. They hit back fast. Hundreds of rockets, drones. Then, fast forward a bit to June 21st, the U.S. gets involved directly.
Coordinated airstrikes?
Yeah, coordinated strikes hitting 3 major Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
And Iran's response to the U.S.?
They targeted the big U.S. base in Qatar, Al Udeid. But interestingly, President Trump actually called it a weak response, which was quite a statement. Then he appealed for things to cool down.
Right, the de-escalation call.
Right.
Which led to the ceasefire declaration on June 23rd. You'd think, okay, maybe things calm down now. But those reports you mentioned earlier, did that ceasefire even hold for like a day?
Barely. It was incredibly shaky from the get-go. Almost immediately, reports came out about Iranian missile fire after the supposed ceasefire deadline.
Heading where?
Causing civilian casualties in Beersheba. In Israel, it triggered air raid alerts again. So yeah, it really put a massive question mark over the whole agreement right away.
And this immediate mess, this volatility, it had a direct knock-on effect in Pakistan. How did Islamabad react?
Very swiftly. They condemned the Israeli attacks, called them blatant provocations, violations of sovereignty, but they also took practical steps.
Like border closures.
Exactly. They shut down 5 border crossings in their southwestern Balochistan province, starting around June 15th.
Why Balochistan specifically?
Well, it shares that border with Iran, and it's a sensitive area for Pakistan anyways, where they did their nuclear tests. It's rich in minerals, gold, copper.
Right.
But it's also historically quite volatile. Plus, security concerns were paramount. We saw over 500 Pakistanis pilgrims, students coming back from Iran through the Taftan crossing around that time.
So Pakistan's reaction really shows that immediate ripple effect. But the strategic game here involves China in a huge way, doesn't it? Their investments in Iran seem directly threatened now. Tell us about that China-Iran relationship.
Oh, it's a big one. It goes back years. They formalized it on June 24th, 2020, with a 25-year strategic partnership.
25 years.
Yeah, and the headline figure was China committing something like U.S. $400 billion into Iran's economy over that time. A massive commitment.
And a lot of that revolves around oil, right? Iran supplying China.
That's a core part of it. Iran agreed to give China a stable supply of oil and at a heavy discount. This basically let China become the main buyer of Iranian oil, getting around international sanctions.
And there are these interesting details about how they're paying, not just dollars. We heard maybe yuan or even barter, gold. What's the significance of that, if it's true?
Well, if confirmed, it's a pretty big deal geopolitically. It's basically a way to bypass the U.S. dollar system, which dominates global oil trade.
Undermining the dollar's power.
Sort of, yeah. It chips away at U.S. financial leverage,
Yeah.
allows Beijing and Tehran to trade outside that sphere of influence. It's more than just avoiding sanctions. It's about economic autonomy.
So it's not just about buying oil. China's putting down roots physically, infrastructure-wise.
Definitely. Look at 2022. Iran gave the green light for a Chinese consulate general right in Bandar Abbas. That's a major port.
Strategic location.
Very. And you see more Chinese nationals around, especially on Kashmir Island. It signals China digging in, expanding its interest there in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And then there's the Belt and Road infrastructure.
Right, the BRI connection.
Key projects like the Persian Bridge that connects Krishim Island to the mainland, and a big freight railway line linking Jin, deep in China, all the way to Iran's Apron Dry Port near Tehran. These are designed as vital overland routes for the BRI.
But beyond the economics and infrastructure, there's a darker side, a military angle to this cooperation. What's the intelligence suggesting about, say, missile components?
Yeah, that's a really sensitive part. Intelligence reports point to Tehran ordering thousands of tons of missile parts from China.
Thousands of tons.
Yeah, things like ammonium perchlorate, that's a key ingredient for solid rocket fuel. Enough, apparently, for potentially up to 800 ballistic missile systems.
Wow.
And it seems to involve specific companies, like Pishkaman Tijarat Rafi Novenko and Lion Commodities Holdings Ltd. So it suggests a pretty established, sensitive military supply chain between them.
Okay, so this deep relationship, especially the military stuff, really highlights the vulnerabilities that this conflict is exposing, doesn't it? Particularly for China's BRI and its energy security. You mentioned Iran supplies a lot of China's oil.
Nearly half of Beijing's imported oil. That makes Iran strategically crucial for China.
But also a huge weak spot now.
Exactly. That supply line is incredibly vulnerable to what's happening in the region, especially around the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not just Iranian oil. Think about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. They also ship huge amounts of energy to China, and it all has to pass through Hormuz.
So any disruption there is a massive problem for Beijing.
Catastrophic, potentially.
And Hormuz isn't the only choke point, is it? What about the Red Sea?
That's another potential flashpoint. If the Houthis get more involved, that could impact the Bab el-Mandeb straight at the other end. Although, interestingly, during the recent Gaza conflict, reports suggested Chinese ships were kind of getting a pass from the Houthis, unlike U.S. or U.K. flagged ones.
That adds another layer.
It does. It shows the complexity of maritime security there.
So, given all these risks at sea, that overland rail corridor you mentioned between China and Iran, that becomes even more important, right, as a backup.
Well, that was the idea. To build resilience, maintain trade if sea lanes get disrupted, reduce reliance on places like the Strait of Malacca, which the U.S. has a lot of influence over. But the problem is that overland route only works if the region is stable. If there are widespread strikes on Iran's infrastructure, that railway line becomes useless pretty quickly. It's not a magic bullet.
Which brings us to maybe the scariest possibility, the real escalation threat. The Pakistan what if. Our sources are picking up on statements from Israeli leaders suggesting maybe that the campaign might not stop with Iran, that Pakistan could be next.
Yeah, that's the really alarming prospect being floated. If Israel were to target Pakistan after dealing with Iran, the implications are just enormous.
Especially for China's Belt and Road.
Hugely.
Yep.
Remember, Pakistan is home to CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Billions invested there, centered around the Gwadar port.
Gwadar is key.
Absolutely critical. If Pakistan gets destabilized, all that Chinese investment, those vital logistics links, they're severely undermined. And it wouldn't stop at Pakistan's border.
Ripples into Central Asia.
For sure. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, they rely on those corridors too. It could effectively cut China off from its western flank, causing that whole logistical axis to just collapse. The stakes couldn't be higher, really.
It really underscores Pakistan's own deep security fears and the incredibly tricky diplomatic position they're in. They share this long, difficult border with Iran. We even saw them exchange missile strikes back in January 2024, right, accusing each other of harboring militants.
That's right. Janj al-Adl on one side, Mbalak separatists on the other. It's a complex history, and Balochistan province is central to their current worries.
We talked about its resources, but it's also politically volatile.
Very. It's Pakistan's biggest province by area, but sparsely populated. And it's seen multiple insurgencies since '47. Groups like the BLA, the BLF, they want more control over the resources, or even independence. And with Gwadar Port sitting right there, crucial for China's CPEC, Balochistan is ground zero for a lot of these tensions.
So Pakistan's worry now is partly internal security, like militants crossing the border if the conflict escalates.
That's a major concern. They worry that members of these armed Baloch groups, who often operate from bases or have ties in Iran's border regions, might flee into Pakistan if things get hot, through those porous borders.
Which is why they closed the crossings.
Exactly. It feels a bit like they're trying to avoid what happened with Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Massive refugee flows overwhelming their resources. They've been dealing with the fallout from Afghan refugees for decades, and recently even expelled many. They don't want to repeat.
And there's another fear, too, isn't there, about Israel's military reach extending closer.
Yes, definitely. Pakistan is very concerned about Israeli air power, let's say, creeping closer to his western border, especially when they hear someone like Netanyahu talking about controlling the skies over Tehran.
Pakistan doesn't recognize Israel, of course.
Right, so they see any growing Israeli influence nearby as a direct challenge to their own security, what they call the security status quo on Pakistan's western flank.
So how is Pakistan trying to navigate this diplomatically? They're mediating, conveying messages from Iran. But it's a tough spot for them, isn't it? Sunni majority, large Shia minority, historic U.S. ties.
It's an incredibly difficult balancing act. They don't want to openly back action against Shia-majority Iran, partly because of potential sectarian issues at home.
But they also want the conflict to end.
Oh, absolutely. They want it over quickly. But some analysts inside Pakistan doubt they have the real capacity, or maybe even the political will, for deep, heavy-lifting mediation right now. Especially as they're also trying to, mend fences and rebuild ties with the U.S., they're walking a very, very fine line.
And if we zoom out again to that big geopolitical chessboard, you could argue that hitting Iran and maybe even Pakistan actually serves longer-term U.S. goals of containing China, right?
That's certainly an argument being made. The logic is that if you weaken or remove key partners like Iran and Pakistan from China's orbit, you seriously hamper Beijing's ability to project power westward.
Cuts off their options.
Yeah. Limits their strategic autonomy, especially in energy and logistics, making them more reliant on sea routes like Malacca, where the U.S. has more influence. And at the same time, it potentially boosts alternatives like the proposed IMP corridor.
The India, Middle East, Europe corridor.
Right, which could position Israel as a key hub on that route, sort of competing with parts of the BRI.
So this isn't just about Iran's nuclear program or regional rivalries. It could fundamentally reshape things for China. What about their diplomatic standing? They brokered that big Saudi-Iran deal.
That was a major diplomatic win for Beijing, showcasing them as a potential peacemaker.
Could this conflict undo that?
It absolutely risks undermining that credibility. If the region descends back into chaos, that achievement looks fragile. It could really damage China's image and, as we've discussed, potentially shatter their whole westward continental strategy, leaving those vital energy lines exposed. So yes, the conflict might serve Israeli national interests, but it also arguably aligns with broader U.S. aims of disrupting those Chinese-backed regional plans.
Okay, so let's free and pull this all together. What we've seen is the immediate, devastating human cost, the logistical chaos from this Israel-Iran conflict.
And then these huge Chinese investments, particularly through the Belt and Road in Iran and Pakistan, looking suddenly very vulnerable.
And tied into that, Pakistan's own really deep security worries about its borders, about instability spilling over.
Yeah, it really just highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? You pull a thread in one part of the world, and it unravels things on the other side of the continent. Grand strategies get challenged, alliances get tested.
So maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. What does it mean for global power dynamics long-term if these key Belt and Road corridors do get seriously destabilized? And how does a country like Pakistan even begin to navigate its future, caught between these great power rivalries and its own internal pressures?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Something that's going to shape geopolitics for years, I suspect.